Hello, my name is Jonathan McCollum. I'm a professor of history here at Brigham Young University, and I am an Ottomanist. That means I'm a specialist in the history of the Ottoman Empire. And I would like to share my screen with you just so we can take a look at this presentation I've prepared for this lecture. Now, I'll be speaking to you about the records of the Ottoman Empire and their uses for family history. Now, I evidently love the Ottoman Empire and its history because that's what I have specialized in. But I hope that through this presentation, you can at least grasp the significance of this empire and its records for tracing your own lineage and finding and discovering your own heritage. Now, one of the exciting things about the Ottoman Empire, aside from the sort of beautiful vistas that the great architects of this empire have produced, is the great diversity of this empire. And also the vast untapped resources of historical records and documents that exist in the former space of this empire, that were produced by this empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, I'd say in the Western world, in say the United States or in Europe, tends to have a reputation of being a sinister or atavistic tyranny that ruled over countless oppressed peoples, be they Arabs or Christians or Jews. Now, we could debate ad nauseum whether this reputation is deserved. However, what is not debatable is that this empire was a successful empire. It ruled the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean world for over 600 years. It emerged in Western Anatolia around the year 1300. And within 2 centuries, it had grown to encompass a great majority of the Eastern Mediterranean world. And by the 17th century, it had grown to look about like this, if we were to define its territories on a map. Now, at its height, the empire ruled over what are now at least 25 independent countries. And it is to this day of historical significance for the 500 million people, 500 million people that now live in this region. Now, it may have ended in the aftermath of the First World War, dissolved, right? And there is no more Ottoman Empire. However, for those people, like perhaps yourselves, that can trace family members to this region, whether it's Romania or Yemen or Algeria or even Iran, this empire is very significant if you hope to find evidence of your ancestors. Now, there's a few things to think about in terms of this empire. I mentioned this earlier, but it's important to recognize the diversity inherent within this particular empire. Now, it was a polyethnic and polyglot empire. That means it hosted a population of millions of different ethnic groups that spoke various different languages. This was not a nation state. There were millions of people that were living, sometimes side by side, but were speaking different mother tongues. And in many cases, these people were separated through ethnic cleansing in the aftermath of the empire, and then formed new countries where those countries had not existed previously. Another thing to keep in mind about this empire is that despite the fact it was ruled by a Muslim sultan, and Islam was, we could consider, the state religion of this state, the majority of the population of the Ottoman Empire until the mid to late 19th century was in fact Christian. And really the heartland of this empire was not just the Middle East. In fact, the heartland was Anatolia and the Balkans. And many of the people living in Anatolia and the Balkans were, of course, Christian. And you had Muslims and Christians living side by side. Now, finally, as we talk about the history of the Ottoman Empire and its significance for family history, we need to consider that the Ottoman Empire, like many other early modern empires, was run on paper. And that means that in order for the capital to communicate with the provinces, it produced a paper trail. And it was also in competition with other European states and empires. And therefore, it often adopted similar political technologies. It attempted to enumerate, surveil, tax, and conscript its population to the greatest extent possible, like its European adversaries. And so it produced millions and millions of records that contain names, dates, locations that are the essentials for discovering one's genealogy. Now, a final word about this empire is that it had something of an official language. While there were dozens of languages spoken throughout the empire, the majority of the records this empire produced were written in a dead language. That language is Ottoman Turkish. Now, in 1928, the current Republic of Turkey conducted a language reform in which it shed off the old sort of Perso-Arabic alphabet that had been used in Ottoman times. And now the official language of the Turkish Republic is modern Turkish, which uses the Latin alphabet. Ottoman Turkish was not just distinct from modern Turkish in its usage of the Perso-Arabic alphabet. It was also distinct in vocabulary and grammar. In fact, the Ottomans did not refer to Ottoman Turkish as Ottoman Turkish in their language. They referred to it as El Sine Selase, which translates to the three languages. For Ottomans, they believed that their language was a perfect amalgamation of three classical Islam: Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. And so they could draw upon the grammar and the vocabulary of these languages as they express themselves in Ottoman Turkish. So this presents a problem because, of course, this is a dead language, one that is not spoken or even written this day. And it's one that is highly complex. It mixes three different languages from three different language families. And therefore, it requires some degree of specialization to learn this language. Now, what I'd like to help you with today is identifying the records that were produced in the Ottoman Empire that will be of most significance for your own family history research. Now, for you, I'd recommend, of course, looking at the records of the 19th and 20th century. There are millions of records that are extant, and they have a great potential for yielding the the genealogical data necessary to establish lineage between different families, and to build individuals' family trees back several centuries. Now, I point towards these records because they represent the most standardized records of the Ottoman Empire, and they are the most inclusive records. They attempted in the 19th and 20th century, the Ottoman state attempted to enumerate and tax the entirety of its population, just as the Europeans were doing. And so it produced records that are very similar to these records that you find in, say, Austria, in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the German Empire, or in the nation state of France from this period. Now, in 1831, the Sultan Mahmud II, he pushed forward the recording of a census for the entire Ottoman population. Now, it didn't turn out to, the empire lacked the resources to produce a complete census. But by 1834, a partial census of the empire was conducted. And these early censuses were conducted every 5 or 7 to 10 years. And they were not as useful as later censuses that the empire would produce, because they only enumerated the male individuals of families. So women are not found in these early census records. However, by the late 19th century, throughout the decade of the 1870s and into the early 1880s, the empire began to collect data on the females of the empire as well. And so by 1882, you have censuses that are being produced that count both male and female members of the female and male subjects, I should say, of the empire. And also they began to issue personal ID cards in 1882 to every subject and citizen of the empire. Now, these personal ID cards are of some significance for us. If you take a look over here, you'll see one of these population certificates, is what they're called, nüfus tezkeresi in Ottoman Turkish. If you take a look at this, and we don't have time to go into the entirety of it, but you will see that it gives the name of the individual. It also gives the name of the individual's father. It gives a description of the individual, and it also locates their birth. It also gives their birth date and birthplace. So these are records that are sometimes held in personal collections, but also records that are maintained in archives. So these are records to watch out for. And they are significant because they can give you the name of an ancestor. They can give you a relationship to a father. They can give you a birthplace, and they can give you, right, a birth date. Now, another record to take a look at are the sort of census records that the empire produced that I've been talking about. These are referred to as the nüfus defterleri. They're the sort of population registers. Now, these are very significant, and unfortunately, they're not all located in one archive. You can find them in the population archive in Ankara, in Turkey, and you can find them in the Central Ottoman Archives in Istanbul, but you can also find them elsewhere. This one, of course, it says is from the Israel State Archives. Now, if you look at this, it gives the names of individuals based on a family. So as the Ottoman record keepers went and located individuals and surveilled them, they they indicated the names of everyone within a household. So this is a later record from 1884. The earlier ones would have just had males, but this one has females. So here you have a family and you have sons and daughters. So the male head of the family at the top and various sons and daughters. You also have birth dates and a location in which these people are living. So this gives, and even these records can give a description of the individual. They can give the profession of an individual, and most importantly, they give you the relationship of the nuclear family. They indicate a male patriarch. They indicate that male patriarch's mother and father by name. They indicate the sons and daughters of that male patriarch and their wives and husbands and their fathers and mothers. So really you get a nice web of familial relations enumerated on these records. Now, finally, I'd like you to take a look at this record here. This is called a tapu senedi. It's a title deed. These didn't emerge in the empire until the year 1858. Prior to that, all population, at least de jure, was owned by the Sultan himself. In 1858, all land was distributed to the population and title deeds were produced. These title deeds do not give you as much information as these two previous documents that I have explained. However, they do give the name of the proprietor. They give the location of the property in exactitude. You can find it even on a map. This one is from, it looks like Samsun. And they also give you a date in which the title deed was issued. These are extant in both private collections and public collections. Now, there's a few other records I would like to speak to you about just in a short minute. These are these long foundation records. These are called wakuf or wakuf. This was a way of transferring property prior to 1858 to individuals. If your family members are Muslim and they're wealthy enough to have property, you can locate individuals with these. There's also the tax registers that are extend even into the 15th century at times, but we'll talk about some of the problems with those. And there's the jizya records. These are the records of non-Muslims that were forced to pay an extra tax that Muslims did not pay. And generally, the male heads of families were enumerated in these jizya records. And finally, there is, in the late 19th century, development of a registry of civil servants. And the Ottoman Empire was not quite as, it did not have a bureaucracy to the extent, say, the United States does today, but at least 92,000 people are enumerated in these records. So if you know that you have a family member that worked for the Ottoman Empire, these are very helpful records. Now, there are earlier records. They have a lot of potential, however, it's unproven. Few people have actually gone through the effort to try to utilize these. Some of these are sort of a special tax register, the Avaraz Defterleri. These can be found for earlier centuries, the 16th and 17th century. Some of these are published in modern Turkish. You can find books of them for different regions. So if you know where your family member is from, you can take a look at those. There are also cadastral surveys, the Tabu Tahrir Defterleri. These are surveys intended the empire intended to utilize these surveys to discover the maximum tax potential of various different provinces of the empire. And many times these would indicate the names of male patriarchs living within the area. And these go back even into the 15th century. We have the jizya registers that I mentioned before. the significance of these are that you'll find male members of a family, but these will only be non-Muslims. You have Islamic court records. These are helpful not just for Muslims, but also for Christians or Jews, because many different religious groups utilize these systems. And so don't think that just because your ancestors were Christian or Jewish, you won't be able to locate them in these court records. However, you do need to know exactly what court district they were living in. And finally, there are sort of grave markers that are spread throughout the Middle East, some in Ottoman Turkish, others in other languages, and they can be helpful in locating deceased ancestors. Now, finally, where do you find these records? Well, that's a little bit tricky. The place to start are the Central Ottoman Archives in Istanbul. This is the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivi, the Ottoman Archives of the Prime Minister's Office, pictured here. This is located in Kağıthane in Istanbul. This is a massive complex, and it is a very helpful archive, and it's accessible to all individuals, both foreign or Turkish citizens. You don't even have to be a professor to go. You can access these archives, but you will first have to fill out some paperwork, and sometimes the functionaries do not speak English, so keep that in mind. You may have to go with a Turkish friend. Other significant archives to keep in mind that are spread throughout the region that have considerable holdings of these Ottoman documents are the Cyril and Methodius National Library in Sofia, pictured here. In Bulgaria, they have quite a large collection purchased from the Ottoman archives in 1931. There's the Historical Archive of Macedonia and Thessaloniki in Greece. It has considerable holdings from the Ottoman period. There are also significant archives in the Middle East as well, if your family members are from there. Important ones to look for are the Tribunal Concerning Matters of Personal Status in Cairo. Unfortunately, this is not very accessible for most individuals. And there's the Center for Historical Documents and the Palace of Justice in Damascus, if your ancestors are from the Levant. Now, the final thing I would like to convey to you is that even if you don't read Ottoman Turkish, these records can be of use to you. I should say that there are many specialists throughout the world in Ottoman language and Ottoman history, and they will be able to decipher these records for you. Most especially, you can find these specialists in Turkey itself. And if you are doing research at the Central Ottoman Archives, keep in mind that you can look around on the internet or even ask around amongst friends, and you'll probably be able to find someone who is either a professor or a fairly advanced graduate student that would be able to read these records for you. Now, I would say that there's plenty of specialists that are willing to help you, but they will help you only for a price. So if you want to spend some Turkish lira on some aid, you will be able to find people that can decipher those for you. Now, the last thing, finally, I'd like to say as I go is that I can be a resource for you. I'm Jonathan McCollum. I work at Brigham Young University. You can look me up and send me an email if you run into any problems. I am willing to take my time to sort of help you go through the process of trying to discover your family heritage in Ottoman records. So keep that in mind. And I'd like to wish you a good day. And if you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me. Goodbye for now.